to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Sulky Threads, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. Our exclusive fabric partners. Be sure to look for their newest lines of fabric.
Welcome to Quiltmaker's Block Network. I'm Diane Harris with Quiltmaker, and today we're going to make Upcycle, block number 168, designed by Karen Griska for Quiltmaker's 100 Blocks Volume 2. We'll talk about how you use selvages in your design. For this block, you'll need a solid fabric, and you'll need a variety of selvages that you've collected from your stash. You'll find everything you need and the cutting dimensions on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll notice a couple of things once you start collecting selvages and cutting from the edges of your fabrics. You'll see that there are lots of different fonts used, and that's a really fun thing to mix it up when you start making your blocks. And another thing to pay attention for is occasionally you'll find a fabric where the selvage is actually colored instead of being white. So here's one example, and then here's another example. And those are really valuable because you can do different things with them when they're colored. Here's one that I found that is actually more of a vintage fabric. That's a really old fabric, and you can tell by the way they constructed the selvage. So you'll find all different kinds of things, and it's really fun to start paying attention to the selvages and to begin to collect them. So you'll start out with your 5 1/4 inch square of your solid fabric, and I have found that it's really helpful to mark the first line where I'm going to place my first selvage. So where that line is 1/4 inch off of the diagonal. So what you do is the 1/4 inch line on your ruler, you put that on the diagonal. So you put those lines right in the corners, so you know that this edge is 1/4 inch off. And then I use, in this case, a light colored chalk pencil to mark that 1/4 inch. So there you see I have a line to work from. And the larger edge, or the larger half, is not covered. What you want to do is cover this smaller half. And I try to start with a really wonderful selvage. Here's one that has lots of pretty color windows, so that's a great one to start with. And you want to pay attention to where you place it. You want to place it so that the prettiest part, or the part you want to feature, is here on the block. So I maybe place it about like so, and then you'll go to your sewing machine and you'll sew very close to this finished edge, just maybe 1/16 of an inch in. And I have found that I really enjoy using some kind of a contrasting thread for this. If you want it to match, you can use a cream colored thread, but I love using a bright thread, and you'll see that when we go to the next step. The normal thing you would think of is that you would sew here next to this raw edge, but this is backwards. You want to sew right here next to this finished edge. And then I usually press, and then I'll get my next selvage, and now I might want to feature some words. And how much of this printed area of the fabric you let show is totally up to you. You can let a little more show, or you can butt this right up close. I usually leave maybe 1/4 of an inch. It's totally up to you, and you just continue sewing right next to that finished edge, and you continue adding selvages, and they don't all have to be exactly the same distance apart. Here we have a nice blue, so I might let a little bit more of that show, and you want to remember that all this will be cut off, so this is how much you will see when the block is finished. And I keep covering until I've covered the entire purple square. These are a couple of the thread options that I considered. Here's a metallic that I thought was really fun, and here's just a slightly variegated thread that also is very interesting. So here you can see where I use the contrasting color, and I really like that look. So as you've sewn your selvages and covered this smaller half of the square, here's what you'll end up with. And if you flip it over, you can see how it looks from the back side. And you may want to trim these off with the scissors as you go. It just is up to you. But at this point, you'll want to use your ruler and rotary cutter and trim this all even so that you have a nice clean 5 1/4 inch square. So once you've finished 4 of these units and trimmed them all up, then you'll be ready to join them together and complete the center of the block. When I got to this point, I noticed that I had the same fabric on these two, and so I made a conscious decision to place them across from each other rather than right next to each other, just because it would look a little more balanced and I would have a little more variety. The one other thing I want to point out here is that sometimes on a selvage, you'll have this really fuzzy edge, and that's a great thing to include. It adds a lot of texture and interest, but you want to be sure that when you sew, you don't sew right here on the fuzzies because they'll fray out. So you want to be sure that you sew up here far enough into that you're actually catching the fabric. So then you'd sew those two together and these two together, and then join the two halves, and that completes the center portion of the block. So to the center portion of the block, you'll want to add longer selvage strips, first to the top and bottom, and then to the sides in sort of a courthouse steps fashion. And then again to the top and the bottom, longer selvage strips, and again to the sides. And how much color you leave showing here is totally up to you. You can have just a little bit like this. You can really bring them in so that there's no color showing at all, or you can have more color. It's totally up to you. So then at this point you would square up to 12 1/2 inches, and that would be your finished block. Once you start playing with selvages, the ideas just start to flow, and it's so much fun. And this is one of the ideas I had, to create the center portion in the way that we talked about. But then here on the edges, I cut my selvages a little bit wider, and I only added the one strip of selvage, first to the top and the bottom, and then to the sides. And then I squared up to my 12 1/2, so that I have all of this color showing all the way around. And I think when you sewed a bunch of blocks like this together, it would just be smashing. And then I had one more idea for something you could do with selvage blocks. Instead of adding just the 2 strips, I thought, what if you just continued to add strips? And so you could make the center portion in the same way, but you could continue to add strips in this courthouse step style to make the block really as large as you wanted. So once you start collecting selvages, you will have so much fun looking for these different little figures and looking for the interesting fonts they've used, or the fun words that sometimes come out. Prince Charming, I thought that was adorable. So you'll just have a great time collecting selvages and using them in this great block by Karen and putting them in your quilts. Come to Quilty Pleasures, which is Quiltmaker's staff blog for all kinds of quilt-related topics, interesting how-tos, beautiful images, and much more. You'll find Upcycle and 99 other fabulous blocks in Quiltmaker's 100 Blocks Volume 2. Thanks for joining me today, and we'll see you next time for another episode of Quiltmaker's Block Network. So now I'm being filmed, me, right? Not just my voice. Okay, here we go.